the Jewish Agency blocked opportunities of freedom and new lives for the survivors, in this case, to manufacture sympathy victims. The possibility of new homes for the Exodus passengers in safe countries like Denmark was blocked by Ben-Gurion. The option of disembarking in southern France instead of returning to Germany, which all the Exodus passengers had, was blocked by the Jewish Agency. In fact, the British confronted Golda Meir, whose name was then Meyerson. They confronted her about this abuse of the Jewish refugees, but she refused to budge. The Exodus passengers would go back to Germany. To paraphrase Israeli professor Edith Zertal, the greater the suffering of these survivors of the Holocaust, the greater their political and media effectiveness for the Zionists. And bear in mind that the entire human cargo of the Exodus, 4,515 people, was less than 1% of President Roosevelt's resettlement plan that the Zionists had sabotaged 3 years earlier. A few months after the Exodus, in November 1947, the UN, violating its own charter, blocked Palestinian self-determination and recommended partition with the implicit creation of a Zionist state. Resolution 181 and the creation of the Israeli state was the direct capitulation to Zionist terrorism, the surrender to the certainty of that continuing terror against the West. Caving to that terrorism left the Palestinians as the sole victims of that continuing terrorism. The alternate UN plan was for a binational state, which the British believed the Palestinians would have reluctantly supported as a compromise to their desire and absolute rights for a democratic state. But this compromise would be, to quote British documents, totally unacceptable to the Zionists, and, quote, would therefore be followed by an intensification of Jewish terrorism. That is, yet greater Zionist terrorism over that which had already brought Palestine to its knees. The disproportionately large land area that the UN gave the Zionists was also in fear of Zionist terrorism. Again, quoting British sources, giving the Zionists so much land up front was an attempt to delay, not prevent, but simply delay the Zionist expansionist wars that they knew would come. This appeasement, of course, failed, though, because within a few months of Resolution 181, the Zionist militias were already waging their first expansionist war, confiscating more than half of the Palestinian side of partition, and massacring and depopulating hundreds of villages. This so-called War of Independence was, in truth, to quote the British High Commissioner at the time, operations based on the mortaring of terrified women and children. Its broadcast, boasting of their successes, quote, both in content and in manner of delivery, are remarkable, like those of Nazi Germany. The Zionists were, quote, jubilant with their campaign of calculated aggression coupled with brutality. British intelligence reported that the Zionists, quote, persecution of Christian Jews, by which I assume they mean converts, and Jews who offend against national discipline, that is, Jews who are insufficiently Zionist, has reached, I quote, medieval standards. But the fact that the British were occupying Palestine enabled Zionist leaders to juxtapose their terror campaign as a liberation movement against British colonizers. Finally, on the 15th of May, 1948, before there was any Arab resistance, Britain fled the scene of its crime, for which the Palestinians have been paying ever since. British and US documents prove that both governments knew all along that the Zionist acceptance of Resolution 181 was a fraud. The Americans knew it, the British knew it, and most of all, the Palestinians knew it. And this, not just the Palestinian refusal to forfeit their right to self-determination, was why their negotiators could not agree to Resolution 181. The armistice that ended the 48 war established a ceasefire line that, to quote from it, is not to be construed in any sense as a political or territorial boundary. Israel was supposed to return to the agreed partition or some other mutually agreed alternative, but it simply refused. Even if one accepts the legality of partition, which I don't, but even if one accepts it, the Israeli occupation of Palestinian land began in 1948, not in 1967. We have today the sense that the situation calmed after 1948. This is completely false. The ethnic cleansing and now cross-armistice line terrorism continue. Israel now holding up the untenable catastrophe it had created and refused to rectify as the threat against which it now had to defend itself. Indeed, Zionist terrorism increased. What changed pre-statehood versus post-statehood is that the victims of Zionist terror no longer included Europeans. Israel's 1967 conquest and its ethnic cleansing of 300,000 more non-Jews heightened its need for ever more settlers. And so when in the 1980s, Jews were able to leave Russia and emigrate to the United States, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, former bigwig of the terror gang Lehi, successfully coerced U.S. President Reagan to close U.S. doors to them. It is to assert this implicit ownership over all Jewry, regardless of their nationality, regardless of their own self-determination, that Israel refuses to allow Israeli nationality. By Israeli law, the nationality of Jewish children of Israel is Jewish, and repeated legal challenges to this abuse of Jews have all failed. Any acknowledgement that a Jewish individual might be free of an intrinsic connection to Israel would undermine its pretense, its messianic pretense, as the obligatory common destiny of Jews because they're Jews. Nationalism and Jews were made one and the same in the service of Zionism. It is consummate irony, then, that Zionism is now being flaunted as Jewish self-determination. I'm sure we've all heard this. Jewish self-determination. It is exactly the opposite. It is the hijacking of Jewish individual self-identity and self-determination. The conflict, quote-unquote conflict, which is, of course, not a conflict in any true sense of the word, could end tomorrow if our own governments wanted it to end. And if this claim sounds exaggerated, I ask you to imagine for a moment how the international community would react if the situation were precisely as it is, but with the ethnicities reversed. If the ethnicities were reversed, the international community would rush their militaries to the region to stop what it now empowers and finances. And the international community would jump to proclaim that equality obviously means the unqualified right of return. It would suddenly be self-evident that you can't ethnically cleanse people and then say that equality does not apply to them because they're not here. That would be a grotesque parody, and it has been a grotesque parody of justice for 70 years. We must do what Edwin Montagu, Jewish member of the British government a century ago, did. We must accuse our governments, the British government, the United States government, most of the EU, of anti-Semitism for colluding with the Zionists. We must fight this as a dual battle. By fighting it as a single struggle for Palestinian liberation, we are allowing the Zionists to control that struggle. By fighting it as the dual struggle that it is, we take back control. We pull the rug out from under their all-important mythical narrative and replace it with the truth. Thank you. I probably spoke for too long, but if anyone has any questions.
It's quite a simplistic one, really. Why is everybody in the world seemingly so frightened of Israel? The country is much more powerful, richer. Everybody actually bows the second Israel says shush, or frightened to offend them. Why? What have they got that everyone is so frightened of? So lots of people got that. Lots of people got that. Why are they so frightened?
Well, obviously, the biggest problem is, as you can tell from my accent, my home country, the United States. That's obviously the biggest problem. Now, at the end of the day, it's all political expedience. It's a combination of the war machine, the arms industry, the military. It's the money that AIPAC gives to U.S. politicians. It's all put together. A large part of it is also the Christian Zionists, because bear in mind that the typical Zionist in the United States is not Jewish, it's Christian.
Yeah.
So you put all this together, and it's easier for politicians to go along with it rather than stand up and try to contest this. It would be the kiss of death. So they go along with it. And as I've tried to demonstrate, the tool that the Zionists are using is this professed identity as Jews themselves. So if you stand up against this, it is turned around on you. And that's why I think we need to address this along with the Palestinian issue. But I think that the answer to why everybody goes along with it, it's a combination of all these elements put together.
So America wagging their tail, does Israel control America, or does America control Israel?
What did America do last week?
I know what they did, but I want to...
You don't need to go very far.
I know, but I'm just interested in what you say.
The dog wagging the tail?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't think I could... I don't think I can give an answer to that. I think it's a symbiotic relationship.
Mutual.
Yeah, I think the United States